This is the Rising Stars Show with Rex Wallace.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Rising Stars. If you haven't heard, this is the show where we go find the brightest minds and stars and we convince them to come onto the show, and then we have a discussion with them where if you think about the middle of a Venn diagram, where their passions and your interests and the things that are most impactful for stars all align. And that's, again, what we're going to do today. I'm your host, Rex Wallace. I want to bring on, before we get too deep into the topic, I want to bring on Mick Toomey. Mick is the CEO of Hyperlift, our sponsor and the co-host of the show. Mick, welcome back.
Thank you, sir.
I also want to bring our guests on. Thanks. Yeah, glad you're here, man. I want to bring our guests on, too. So today we have Dr. Muraima Rios, who is the STARS director for Medical Card System, or MCS. It's a high-performing 4.5-star plan in Puerto Rico. Dr. Rios, thank you for coming today. Good to have you.
Well, thanks for the invite. I'm glad to be here.
And our next guest is Paul Ingram, the chief scientist for Hyperlift. So, Paul,
hey,
welcome.
Good to see
welcome
you guys.
aboard. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
So, with all I guess the first thing I want to say, I feel the need to say, right, is we've never had a show with so many doctors and scientists, and the first thing I want to assure our audience is nothing's going to get blown up. And the only thing we're going to dissect is the Tukey outlier deletion methodology. So no frogs, no mice will be harmed in this episode. So no need to turn your video off. But Mick, let's start with you actually, because we want to talk about Tukey today, right? This is our topic, and this is, in my strong opinion, the most impactful change that we'll see in measurement year 2022 or for 2024 stars, right? So.
Yeah.
And if you think back, it's, this is CMS's attempt to make cut points more predictable, I know. You're trying to listen to plans' concerns about these cut points being too volatile. But at 30,000 feet, tell us what Tukey is and why do we need to care about it?
At a 30,000 foot level, like you said, it's an outlier deletion methodology. They want to stabilize, they want to make the cut points more predictable. And, at that level, I think it makes a ton of sense and pretty straightforward. The reality is, as you start dialing into some of the nuance that gets associated with it, and I imagine we'll touch on some of that stuff today, there's a whole lot of broader impact that this is going to have. And I frankly think, I agree with you that it's arguably the most impactful thing for STARS 2024. I think that there is a certain level of knowledge out there about how all this works and how this could impact, my contract. But I think that there are also a lot of details that come into play that frankly put contracts that you might not naturally think are at risk. And so I'm looking forward to jumping in today and kind of uncovering, some of the nuance here.
Yeah. Muraima, so from a, you're at the plan, right? You're leading stars for a high-performing organization. You have all these changes coming, including Tukey, this new cut point methodology. Take us down below 30,000 feet. So as the stars leader at a plan, what's, where does your mind go when you think about Tukey? What are you concerned about, and how do you see it playing out?
Well, I think for us, our biggest concern is the measures that we don't do extremely well, where we are in the 2 to 3 stars, which is where we're seeing that Tukey will impact the most. So as an organization, we're looking at those measures and see how can I work with them and see them as my areas of opportunity to improve them, and then won't have such a big impact on Tukey and my scores.
And, I want to jump in on something there because, we were doing that presentation at your virtual conference yesterday, actually. And Paul had run a series of numbers to help us kind of look at STARS 2021. And what I found was interesting, as Muraima was saying, you're seeing a lot of change, the biggest changes on those 2 and 3 star cut points. But you're still seeing some changes on the 4 and 5 star cut points. And I was surprised to see when we kind of ran numbers for sample contracts, the number of 4.5, 5-star plans that actually dropped. based on some of this. So to me, and I think what Mariah was saying is very common. For us too, you tend to focus on the 2 and 3 star measures that you have, and probably not as much on the higher ones. But there is something to be said about looking at where you are in the cut point range. Because if you're on the lower end of any of these cut points, I think you're at risk with this.
Yeah, I know.
No, I agree with you exactly. What you just said. It's we can't forget about the 5 stars threshold. So we're pegging the measures that we do well. We're not holding back. We're gonna keep doing strategies to make sure they stay in 5 and 4.
So Paul, help us from a data sciencey perspective. Let's get a little more sciencey than we've gotten so far. But help us understand, a little bit more detailed, what this is, what exactly it does, and what impact it has on measure level cut points.
Hey, yeah. So I think one of the things when we think about Tukey, first off, if we step back, is just what is it doing overall for CMS and for the plans, right? And one of the top considerations when you're trying to manage plans to a metric is removing volatility and all these outside impacts. And so Tukey is an outlier detection methodology which strips off these odd outliers that have undue influence on the overall cut point year over year. And if you think about it, and you see this in your everyday life, common events that are well within the norm kind of operate in a reasonable band. But then the outliers are what are really surprising, and they can change the overall landscape. And so Tukey as a methodology is answering the question, how do we detect what are those outliers, and then how do we get rid of them? And so what the algorithm tries to do intuitively is figure out what is sort of common in the middle, and then what is a good rule that sets up what they call the fences, the Tukey fences on either side, and then data points that fall below those fences on the low end or above those fences on the high end can be considered outliers and deleted. And then the real art is determining what's that sensitivity. How many outliers do we want to get rid of, and how many do we want to keep? And I think one thing I was going to mention earlier, as Mick was talking about Tukey and its relative importance and the impact it's supposed to have on plans, is that in the coming STARS 2024, when they start applying this, it's one of the major outside factors that plans have no control over, because you can adjust your star rating within certain parameters, but ultimately what the plans don't control is the impact of math on top of that clustering algorithm that determines the cut points. That's sort of this outside area where they have to look at it and determine how much investment do they need to make to cushion themselves against the shock that applying these outlier cut points are going to have, or removing the outliers will have on top of the cut points.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting as we're looking at that fulcrum impact, the seesaw impact we were calling it the other day. Depending on where those outliers sit, it can have a major impact on the overall new structure of the clusters. We looked at that example, that graphic from yesterday, where we were looking at breast cancer screening and med-adherence for hypertension, and you had just one outlier that got deleted from the bottom from both, but one was significantly, in breast cancer screening, was significantly below where the pack was, versus hypertension was a little bit closer. And so you saw no impact on the hypertension cut points, not a single one. But you saw the breast cancer screening cut points, at least at the 2 and 3 bands, jump up, 10-ish points. So really significant impact by just removing one measure. And I think that's the stuff that I think might be kind of news to a lot of people out there, that just removing one measure can have that much of an impact.
Yeah, that whole seesaw image was helpful, right? Because, and I remember at least a couple of times, and Miram, I'm sure you remember this. In STARS over the past few years, there have been a couple of times where the cut points changed so much because of one outlier. Like one health plan would be performing so far below everyone else on one measure in 1 year because of whatever reason, it would essentially become its own cut point, right? Its own star rating level. So like the 1-star measure would be, rather than a cluster of plans in this low performing group down here, it would be one plan. And then, that shifts all the other cut points and it has a significant impact. So, I mean, I can see that, I know the goal here from CMS is to, well, I guess we can argue what the goal is, right? I think, the stated goal is to make cut points more predictable by removing outliers. That should be a good thing, right? Like that's all good. We want the cut points to be more predictable. We don't want them to be volatile. We want to be able to better forecast our future performance. That's not always the way it plays out because, in their scenario modeling, in the scenario modeling that I've seen Paul, you conduct, I mean, it has a more significant impact on those lower stars, which makes it harder to hit stars, right? So it lowers the performance of the industry more than it helps. It might help a couple of plans because it does have some impact on the upper end, but why is there more impact on the lower end?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things. One, I wanted to take a stab at thinking through what the interest of CMS might be here as well, right? Because obviously making cut points more predictable helps plans do their planning for what they need to invest in, and that's really important because it stabilizes kind of the strategy set that you want to apply. But it also it allows CMS to get the results it wants more consistently, right? So when they set policy using numbers, the more consistent that those numbers are, the more they can predict what the theoretical outcome will be for plan behavior. When you think about why it affects certain plans more dramatically, you had an interesting comment earlier, which was it lowers the industry, and I think the theory is that if we remove the outliers, you actually get a better picture of the industry as it stands today. And so the trick with outliers are that they actually have no impact on the industry. What they are is they're reshaping the way we're assessing the industry. So somebody who is a 3-star looks really good because maybe they're a low 3-star, almost against that cut point. They look really good relative to the 2 stars because that one outlier is pulling all of those cut points down. But then as soon as we remove the outlier and say, actually, this is a better picture of the industry, now you have a more real sense of where you place within it. And the reason why it affects lower outliers, I think, is because plans all try to manage to have higher performance. So if you look at the distribution of scores for any given measure, let's just take one that's ranked between 0 and 100, for example, right? You would see most of the bulk skewed somewhere between maybe 70 and 100 because plans are actively trying to push that measure value up, assuming it's not inverted, right? So the amount of outliers that you can have on that upper level where we're saying, okay, 100 is the top and everybody's pushing for it, there's probably going to be fewer outliers up there because that's where everybody's trying to push to. So when you do this Tukey calculation, the upper fence is somewhere way past 100. So you're unlikely to delete a top outlier. But the stragglers are outliers because they're underperforming dramatically in an environment where everybody should want to be pushing north. So you're going to see changes on the low end. And then what Mick was alluding to, where you've got measures and you have data points that are either like outliers that are either close to where most of the data lives versus far away, because of the way the clustering works that CMS is using, the distance that those outliers are to sort of the density or where most of the other plans behave will directly impact their power to influence cut points. So the further away they are, the algorithm that's trying to figure out how do I divide that group of plans into 5 sections, 1 star, 2 star, 3 star, and so on, they'll have disproportionate influence the more of an outlier they are. And so you'll find in measures, if we look at this slide, the tale of two measures slide, you'll find in measures where most of things are pretty clustered together. There's a tiny little outlier, but it's not really all that dramatic. There's hardly going to be any change because the solution to that clustering algorithm remains approximately the same. Whereas for ones where you have dramatic outliers, boy, the solution to that algorithm changes, and it's almost like an elastic band. It's like I was holding the elastic band out here and it goes like that. So that's why you see disproportionate effect.
Yeah, and my view to also going to jump on that question, Rex. I think you're going to see more upward pressure on it because of that whole distance from the group factor. Because if you're like Paul was saying, you've got everybody up in the 70 to 90 range. There's only so high you can go. There's only so far you can go away from the pack. But if you're in that 70 to 90 range, there's a whole lot more room that you can drop. And like what we saw in that breast cancer screening versus med adherence for hypertension example, if you're down here, if you're far from that group, you're going to have a huge impact. And so just with those kind of fundamental principles in place, just naturally, you're going to see things move up more than move down as a general rule.
So, and I love that example where it shows breast cancer screening jumping, much more than 5 points. And let's talk about that for a second, because if I'm a stars leader, I'm thinking, but we've got guardrails. Guardrails are coming into play for 2023 stars. They're gonna keep this more predictable by themselves. They're gonna keep all these cut points from shifting more than 5 points or 5%. In 2024, right?
That's the natural expectation. I think people, if they saw that slide for the tale of two measures, you're going to be like, yeah, but it's not going to go from 50 to 66 because that's more than 5%. But the reality is that it absolutely could do that. And that's because when the way CMS has got it structured, when they're prepping for the STARS 2024 cut points, we're getting ready to apply that guardrail. They're going to first run the Tukey analysis on the STARS 2023 cut points. So if we see kind of similar situations, you're going to see those big jumps, and then the 5% is attached to that. So I think the reality is the guardrails are applied, but I don't know that it's always going to feel like that.
This is a question I think for the MCS team. Is, let's say, 5 points on a scale of 1 to 100. How big of a jump is that to you all when you're thinking about managing a plan? Because to me, especially if the plans are, you're either really close to those cut points, even with a guardrail, it still makes it challenging for those plans that are navigating that particular area, plus or minus 5 around that cut point, the historical cut point, that is.
Well, it depends on the measure. Like, for example, like breast cancer screening, moving 5 points in 1 year, it might be harder because you need to get someone to go and get a mammography done. Or medication adherence, like for us, we have struggled with medication adherence measures for as long as I've been in STARS. So for me telling you, yeah, we can move 5 points in STARS for the medication adherence measures, that's not going to happen unless we re-engineer the whole thing. And basically that takes more than 1 year to do it. But there are the measures that we can control a little bit more, and then we can secure the points and make sure we can get 5 points ahead. But even that, it's moving 5 points in per measure. It's kind of a complicated thing to do. So you try to move to maintain your improvement, but there are measures you won't be able to do it, especially the measures that you're already up. I mean, there's so much you can improve from the measure that you're already on like the COA measures. If you're a 98, you can't improve more than that. I mean, there's no way. You're not going to have more than 5 stars. So it kind of gets out of a balance of where you are, where you want to be. But it's complicated.
That's a really good point, because I do think that ultimately the Tukey thing is going to be really good for plans. I think it's going to be a bear in STARS 2024. But once you hit STARS 2025, we start prepping for that and beyond. I think it's way more straightforward, and it's exactly because of what she was just saying. If you've removed the outliers, then you don't have one contract here, 2 contracts there, really moving the needle on anything. And for a plan to be able, for the industry to be able to move an entire measure up 5 points, it's just not going to happen in reality. And so I think that while the guardrails are there, I'm not even convinced that they're going to be applied, because I think it would take so much industry-wide movement to get that kind of shift in cut points. But I guess time will tell.
Yeah, and you can't apply guardrails to new measures, which are the ones that typically move that much. Like I remember when MRP came in the second year, it came like 20 points higher for 1 star. But then that can still happen for new measures. So guardrails won't protect you against that.
Yeah, on MRP, those first 3 years or so, and I have a slide that I sometimes show in presentations with that very measure, because to show that how cut points change so dramatically early on. But if you performed at exactly the same percentage for 3 straight years, those 3 years in MRP, you would have been 3 different stars. Like it was like 3, 2, and 1, right? Because the industry does increase so much in those early years of a measure adoption. And I think, if we look at, so I think some really important elements here are, number one, guardrails coming into play for 2023 stars. Guardrails, and keep me honest here, but guardrails don't apply to caps. They don't, and like Marama, you said, they don't apply to new measures. So any measure that hasn't been on for at least 3 years or longer will not have guardrails applied to it. Tukey also doesn't apply in 2024 stars. It doesn't apply to caps, but it does apply to new measures. So TRC, FMC, PCR coming back, CVP, right? Those all Tukey will apply to all of those in 2024 stars. But the really important element, and we've talked about this a little bit here, and I think this is the thing that plans need to understand when they're building their 2024 stars projections, is that fact that, like, and Mick, I've heard you say this, but 2024 is a real anomaly, right? It's just such a unique year where all of this kind of stuff comes into play, where to apply Tukey in 2024 stars, they have to create a new baseline for it. So they have to go back and reapply Tukey to 2023 stars and create new kind of mock 2023 stars cut points that serve as the new baseline for 2024 stars. So, Mick, like you were saying, those guardrails apply to the new recalculated kind of mock 2023 Tukey cut points. So they only move 5 points from that, but like we've seen on the breast cancer screening example, they can move 16 points. They might move 30 points, right? Like that 2-star threshold might jump to, might jump 30 points, right?
Yeah, and I think that was something I hadn't thought about as Mick and you all were talking about. This is exactly right. When we were doing this modeling, just for the example purposes, we're looking at it from the perspective of just within 2021, and then you're talking about guardrails, but they will be indexed against that new measure that gets calculated, and that new measure is going to be that 16-point jump, because when they apply it in 2023. Presumably, there will be 1 or 2 outliers, because those plans that were outliers may improve a little bit, but dramatic improvement, as we're hearing here, is pretty hard for a lot of measures. And so, when they get eliminated, your new baseline kind of overrides the guardrail, so to speak, for year 1.
Well, and I think you touched on something interesting there, and this is something that's kind of been percolating in my head as we've been going through all of this. You said something about, assuming there's still, an outlier in there, then that'll get removed. The way I'm looking at this is, it really doesn't matter, because if there's an outlier, Tukey's going to remove it and then rerun it, and you're going to have it right here. If there's not an outlier, you're going to still be right here, because there's no need, because you have nothing dragging it down. So this is part of the reason that I think it's actually good, because Stars 2024 to me is like a right sizing. Right, it's righting the ship this one time, so we're taking the big hit. Gonna be tough on a lot of plans, especially if they're not really kind of looking at this at a relatively nuanced level. But going through that process, you're either gonna get the outliers Tukey'd away, or organically they're just gonna go away. In any case, you're gonna end up with a very solid, predictable, stable level of cut points. So the Tukey is just getting it where, in my opinion, it probably should be anyway.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that does also raise the competitiveness bar, though, within the plans for measure performance, because once you do strip away particularly the lower outliers, suddenly you're now having to really contemplate your investment, because while the stars are more predictable and the cut points become more predictable, you also run into the problem of, they just got a lot more competitive too, because you no longer have these lower end outliers who are helping kind of build a little cushion on the downside.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Rex. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say I agree with you, because as a health plan, we look at the measures now. Like we used to think, oh, okay, this measure we might score lower. So you tinker with it, what you can do, what you can't do. Now you can't hold back on any measure. You have to throw yourself in. You have to do the best you can, because like Mick mentioned, it's either we're in the side of the Tukey, or we're outside as an outlier and we're going to be cut out. So you need to put everything you can and everything you can do to make sure you don't be the one left out. So when the cut points are in, you are within the 2, 3, or 4-star range, depending on which measure we're talking to.
Well, and you bring up a good point, Mariama, because I think that a lot of plans are going to be looking at the 2 and 3 stars, but you're talking about making sure that you're looking across the spectrum. Because if you think about how the other stars' performance levers could be impacted, first blush, you probably don't think QI is touched at all, right? Because it's all kind of score-driven, not rating-driven. But when you think about the hold harmless provision, and if you're 4 stars, you don't have to use QI, right? If it hurts your score. But as we saw, and we were looking at some of those sample plans yesterday, 4 and 5-star plans can drop a bit. And if you're on that bubble of 4 stars, all of a sudden QI is a lot more important to you. Because if you drop and you're 3.74 instead of 3.89, now QI at those 10 weighted points are pretty significant.
Yeah, when you combine that with the reward factor, you things get a lot bigger for you. Like you bring QI because it's really important, but you want to hit also the variance for reward factor. If you're a 4-star plan and you're trying to get to the 4.5 or 5-star plans, you need to work with your reward factor. It's really hard to do it on its own.
100%.
So therefore, you need to make sure that the score that you get and the variance you get, it's really good. So if you have like a couple of measures between 2 and 3 stars, you can't afford to have like a whole difference, like all the measures in 5 stars are here, and then I got 1 on 2 stars and 1 and 3 stars. You need to balance the equation to make sure you hit reward factor in the highest point, so you can actually aim for the higher star. And Tukey can affect that to you, because like for us, I mean, I look at it as a high performance plan. There's still a few measures that we don't score that well, and that's pulling our variance. And we every year we look at them. We look at how can we make the variance smaller so we can make sure we hit to the 0.40 for reward factor and we get the highest score. Right. And without Tukey, sometimes it's hard. Right now, it's going to be even harder when you bring Tukey to the equation. Even in the long run, as Mick said, it's going to be more predictable, more easy to work with. In 2024, it's going to make it way more complicated.
I totally agree, and I'm so glad you brought that up. I mean, you think about the reward factor. How many plans rely on 20, 30, 40 basis points being added to their score, right, to get them up into that 5-star, into that 4.5-star range? And as Moriam was talking about, it doesn't take many measures on either the mean or the variance side to bring you down, 10 basis points on that reward factor. So again, if you're one of the plans that you're like, look, we're a 4.5-star plan, been there forever, not worried, we don't have a lot of 2 and 3-star measures, this reward factor can have a big impact. Again, you lose a couple of points, in a couple of measures, and your reward factor looks like 10 points versus 20, and that can be significant.
It only takes you one measure. If you lose one measure
Totally
to the wrong
right.
star, either up or down, it takes your reward factor away. So it's
Exactly
it's
right.
really complex.
Right.
All these
Yeah,
moving
if
parts
you're-
all coming together, being impacted by this one thing.
I think one thing when I'm also wondering here is not being a plan operator myself, but looking at it as an analyst, I imagine that this also raises the value of the analytics team's inputs to future strategy. Because when I think about the changes that Tukey brings and the stability it brings, one thing that's nice about analytics teams is the more stable your data set, the more valuable the forecast, right, and the more valuable the output. And I think that you should see that when it comes to weighting information in the strategy decision process, suddenly these forecasts that the teams are going to be looking out in 24, 25, 26, or actually 25, 26, 27, you should feel a little more confident in them. And in turn, they get a lot more weight and input in how the strategy is going to work. And so you're moving away more and more from gut feel, and we're starting to understand the underlying market dynamic, which is going to be a lot more predictable.
One thing I want to make sure that all the listeners, especially health plans, understand, because I think with because everything we're saying is spot on. I think as far as 2024 stars is going to be really hard. 2025 stars because of Tukey, cut points are going to get more predictable, which is a good thing. But I think and Mick, you were saying earlier, sort of 2024 stars is sort of a right sizing year, right?
Yeah.
But the impact of that right sizing will be felt for the next 6 to 8 years, because if you look at CMS's scenario modeling, they expect to pay $4 billion less in quality bonus payments between now and 2030 because of this change. So that's not all in 2024 stars, right? So 2024 stars, there will be a sort of a day of reckoning, and we will, cut points will shift dramatically, but it will take years for some plans to overcome the impact of that. I think to catch up with the competition and to achieve those new thresholds that were set in 2024 stars. I just think, it will be felt for a long time. So even though the cut points will be more predictable after 2024 stars will not get easier after 2024 stars.
No, you're exactly right. I mean, this shift that you're seeing, this big jump, right? It's not 2024 then going away. You're establishing kind of the new normal. And so, yeah, it's going to be, as Mariano was saying earlier, it's not easy to bump up a measure 5 points. And if you're all of a sudden well below, there's a few years of work ahead of you to try to catch back up.
If you take into consideration the new measures that are coming in, our measures are complex. It's how you work with them and how as a plan you deal with the new measures that are coming in that you will be able to attain the stars that you have. Stay in the same star. I'm not even mentioning going up. Just staying within the same stars, because they're removing the measures that you tend to do well because they're top out measures, so they're out of the picture. They're bringing new measures that you have to get used to. Even though you're seeing them in display, they're not the same once they change to stars. Like plans put way more effort in a measure once it transitions to stars than when the measure is in display. So therefore, you might see a scenario where the national average for a measure is X amount when it's in displays, and then when it moves to stars, it went up like for 20 points. So it's how you capture those changes and how you get prepared for the changes that are coming in, and how you keep aligned with the policy aspect. What measures are coming up, then you prepare for the long run, because Tukey will impact 2024, but like you mentioned, Rex, this is a long run. This is a marathon that we're running, so you got to prepare yourself for what's coming ahead of Tukey.
And dig into that just a little bit more. So as a stars leader, so we've talked about what Tukey is. It removes outliers. It makes cut points more predictable. The impact it's going to have. I mean, the scenario modeling says 15% of plans in year one are going to drop half a star. And then CMS is going to save $4 billion in payments over the next 6 or 8 years. So we know a lot of plans are going to perform lower than they are now. So that's the impact, and the impact is not just on low performing plans, but like we've said, 5-star plans are at risk of dropping below 5 because of this change too. But Mariama, like from your shoes, sitting in the seat of a stars leader, how does this change how you manage stars, over the next couple of years, right? Like, what are you doing differently that you weren't doing yesterday?
I think as a team, our leaders we're focusing more on what we can control and work towards that. Like Tukey will bring on the table a lot of changes, but for example, the operational measures, and we have to get to them because they're going to wait for now. So when you look at Tukey, you're seeing, it can impact those measures a lot. So you need to make sure you got those measures in the bag. And you aim for 5 stars in each one of those measures. Because then we got the CAPS measures that are coming up as well. And that's the big noise now. We are talking about CAPS and how CAPS is impacting stars. But then the other child, which is operational measures. And you have to pay attention to that too, because that's where Tukey might have the biggest impact. So we're making sure that our operation internally is strong, and we make sure those measures are down, because it's a structure that you can control. You can't control an output of a lot of things. You can't control. You can do campaigns and caps and make sure that you do everything you can, but at the end of the day, it's how people perceive and how people answer the questions that are going to determine your score. But when it comes to operational measures, it's how you run your operation internally, how well you handle the appeals process, how well do you the CDMs, your membership is growing, how well as a plan you adapt to membership, because that's going to bring up CDMs, and that's going to bring up a lot of things to the equation. And for the last, not the least, the TTY foreign language measures, those are 2 measures. And you just need to have an interpreter available within 8 minutes, but they can give us a headache. When we're running our models, those measures were one of the few that will bring the highest jumps when it comes to the stars changes. So you have to pay attention to how you run your process internally and make sure you get everything on schedule.
Yeah, I think that what you were just saying is spot on. Like, you've got to have a really good handle on what's going on, operationally, right, within the organization. But I think that there's another aspect to consider too, and it is this kind of perfect storm, this tsunami of what has been the STARS world over the past few years. Because if you think about it, we had COVID come in, we had better of methodology, right? And so better of guidance, where I'm going with this is there's a transparency, there's a line of communication that I think is going to be challenging for a lot of plans. You've got a lot of plans out there, a lot of STARS leaders trying to explain to leadership that, yeah, we got a 4-star last year, but there was this better of impact that really helped us. And the reality is, I'm not as confident that we can maintain, but once a leader sees 4 stars, 4.5 stars, 5 stars, they think that's where now we are. And so I think that there's a challenge, about that. You add to that the whole shift of weighting change. So everybody's been talking about caps and ops now for a year because of the weight shift. So it's helping then explain that shift. And then when you come off better of, then you've got all this new weighting. And now the next year we have Tukey, where you're going to see a lot of drops. I mean, I feel for Moriaba, and those people out there that have to then communicate why our numbers kind of might be looking like this when nothing's really changed, or we're actually better. It's a challenge to get that message across, I would think.
Oh, it is. It is a challenge. I think I'm lucky. I'm lucky here because, like, management, they know what STARS is. As a company, we adopt STARS in our system, and I say we because it's a team effort. We work towards getting the best results, but we understand the market, and I think our management thing has been really successful in understanding that the market is changing. Like you mentioned, maybe the STARS 2022 results are a little bit inflated because we got the better off 2 years. Even though as a plan, I have to say we did really good. We respectfully, we did really good that year. But it's good to understand that point. I mean, for us in Puerto Rico, since STARS 2019, we have the Maria effect. We haven't had a single cycle of STARS that has act normally. So right. Now we got Maria, then we got hurricanes, then we kept having stops. So I think we've been using the best of both worlds for a while. So 2023 is the first time that we're going to have everything. Well, we still can use HOS for the last year as well, but
yeah,
right, yeah.
But they're just one weight, so shouldn't have that much of an impact.
But yeah, you need to create that culture inside your organization that everyone understands the changes that are going in the system and how those changes impact your company and how those changes impact the system. So everyone is on board and everyone is in the same boat, rowing in the same place, so we can get there as a team.
Yeah, you've hit on it. It's making sure that everybody understands that. And frankly, if you're a plan leader, you need to be understanding all the different ways that our plan can get impacted this year with all of this stuff, and how are we prepping for it.
Mick, one thing I want to add in there too, because we're talking about the communication with the executive teams who are looking at performance. I think you also have to change the mindset as it relates to investment, because right now, when people are investing in in improving their measure performance, they're looking for measures to go up, and they say that's the win. It's not keeping it stable, it's to go up. However, what we need to worry about is, because of the way Tukey works, we've seen this already in certain measures where the performance is so tight that you're actually not, your investment is all about staying still. It's not about trying to increase. And that's eventually what it resolves into over, say, 5-10 years, right? It's the plans get more and more dense together, and suddenly we need to change the way we think about investment. The marginal value of the dollar is actually keeping you stable. It's loss prevention. And it might change the way we think about stars management. So it's not so much about how do we obtain a higher score. It's more about risk management. How do I just stop myself from dropping at some point? And then there will be other measures that you'll have to kind of push up, and that changes the investment landscape from a dollars to return.
100% downside protection and upside harvesting. I mean, that combination is what makes it all work.
Upside harvesting. It's gonna be our new catchphrase.
You like that?
Hey, I think so. Great job of. I think we've effectively dissected Tukey, right? So feels like we touched on all the important elements of it, and there are a lot, right? There's a lot to know. So thanks for all the insights. So I want to thank our guests, Mariah Rios from MCS and Paul Ingram from Hyperlift. Thanks so much for all your insights today. Super valuable. Mick, thanks for co-hosting and being back on the show and in sponsorship of Hyperlift. Much appreciated. And I think we're going to call it a wrap. So thanks, everyone. Appreciate all the insights, and we'll talk next time. Thanks.